Dessa Calloway had been 18 for 4 days when her stepfather set her backpack on the front porch and told her she no longer belonged inside. The morning was cold enough to turn breath white. She stood beneath the porch light with her hands at her sides, staring at the man who had eaten dinner across from her for nearly a decade. Dennis Calloway looked somewhere past her left shoulder. Not at her face, not at the backpack. Somewhere in the middle distance where discomfort goes when people refuse to carry it. "You're an adult now," he said. "I've done what I could." Dessa didn't move. Behind him through the narrow gap where the door hadn't fully closed, she could see the hallway where her mother's photograph still hung beside the stairs. Same silver frame, same summer light catching her mother's hair. 6 months earlier, that hallway had smelled of coffee and wood polish, and the particular warmth of a house that knows it's loved. Now it felt like a waiting room belonging to someone else. "Mom wanted me to stay until I finished school," Dessa said. Dennis finally looked at her, just for a moment. "Your mother isn't here." He handed her an envelope without another word. Inside, $87 in mixed bills and the title to a 2003 sedan that burned oil and pulled slightly to the left at highway speeds. He did not hug her. He did not say her name. The door closed with a sound so ordinary it felt almost cruel in its normalcy. Not a slam, not a statement, just a latch clicking into place. The way latches do 1,000 times a day in houses where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen. Dessa picked up the backpack. She stood on the porch for another minute, maybe two, listening to the silence on the other side of that door. Then she walked to the car, put the backpack in the back seat beside a box of clothes and her sketchbook, and the silver necklace her mother had worn every single day of Dessa's remembered life, and she drove until the neighborhood disappeared behind her. She didn't know where she was going. That was the truest thing she knew. By nightfall, she had parked behind a 24-hour grocery store on the east side of town, where the lights in the parking lot stayed on all night, and the security camera above the loading dock faced the other direction. She locked the doors. She reclined the seat as far as it would go, which was not far enough. She pulled her coat over herself like a blanket. Sleep came the way it does when the body is exhausted and the mind refuses to stop in pieces and fragments, interrupted by every engine that started nearby and every shadow that crossed the windshield, and every moment her brain surfaced long enough to remind her that she was sleeping in a parking lot because no one in the world had a room with her name on it. She woke before sunrise with a stiff neck and the specific hollow feeling of a person who has not eaten since yesterday morning. The store bathroom had a mirror. She looked at herself in it for a long time. She washed her face. She bought the cheapest coffee they had and a pack of crackers and sat in the car watching the sky go from black to gray to the pale, non-committal blue of early winter morning. She called 2 people from her phone's contact list. One didn't answer. One answered and said she was really sorry, but her apartment had a strict no-guest policy, and her landlord checked, and she really was sorry. Dessa said it was fine. She said it twice to make sure it sounded true. By the third day, the $87 had become $59. The fuel gauge hovered just above the red line. She'd moved the car twice to avoid looking like she was living in it, which she was. She spent those hours in the public library mostly. It was warm and no one asked questions, and the chairs near the window were quiet in the late afternoon. She drew in her sketchbook to keep her hands from shaking the old courthouse across the street. The bare-limbed oak tree outside the entrance, a fire hydrant she had no particular feeling about, but which gave her pencil something to do while her thoughts ran in circles too tight to follow. It was in the library parking lot on the third afternoon when her phone rang from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. "Is this Dessa Calloway?" A man's voice, careful and unhurried. "Yes. My name is Arthur Hale. I'm an attorney based in Harwick County. I've been trying to reach you for several days regarding the estate of Miss Miriam Calloway." Dessa tightened her grip on the phone. Her knuckles went pale. "I don't know anyone named Miriam. She was your great aunt, your mother's father's older sister. Miss Calloway passed away last spring. She left specific instructions that her property transferred to you following your 18th birthday. I've been attempting to locate you since the date passed." The library parking lot felt very far away suddenly. The bare oak tree, the fire hydrant, the ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Property, Dessa said. Yes, a significant parcel. I'd prefer to explain the details in person if you're able to come to Harwick. It's roughly 90 minutes north of your current area. Dessa looked at the fuel gauge in her head. 90 minutes. She looked at the $59. I can come, she said. Arthur Hale's office occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building above a pharmacy on Harwick's main street. The town itself was the kind of place that had been handsome once and had aged into something quieter. Brick sidewalks, faded awnings, a hardware store that had probably been there since before anyone currently living could remember. The kind of town where people knew which houses had been in which families for how many generations, and considered that information important. Arthur was a lean man in his early 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the particular patience of someone who had delivered difficult news so many times that he had learned to let silence do some of the work. He shook Dessa's hand, offered her coffee, which she accepted because she hadn't had anything since morning, and then he slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside was a photograph. Dessa looked at it for a long time. The house in the photograph was enormous. Columned front porch, steeply pitched roof, windows that went nearly floor to ceiling on the first floor, white paint that had long since surrendered to weather going gray and green in patches peeling in long strips from the columns. The grounds visible in the image, what must have been formal gardens at some earlier point, had gone completely wild. Tall grass and untrimmed hedges, reclaiming everything that careful hands had once arranged. Several windows on the upper floor were boarded with plywood. Vines had taken hold of the east corner and were working their way toward the roofline. Miriam Calloway owned this, Dessa said. She inherited it and lived in a caretaker's cottage behind the main house until her death. The main building has been unoccupied for many years. Arthur set down his coffee. I want to be honest with you, Miss Calloway. The property has no mortgage outstanding, so it comes to you clear of debt. However, property taxes and ongoing maintenance will become your responsibility from the date of transfer. There's also a complication I need to make you aware of. He opened a second folder. A development company, Valor Group, filed an option claim on the surrounding parcels 18 months ago. The option includes a right of first purchase on the Ashworth estate, specifically if the new owner fails to resolve outstanding tax obligations within 90 days of inheritance transfer. Dessa looked up from the photograph. How much from $14,200 due in 90 days? She did the arithmetic without meaning to. $87 in an envelope, $59 remaining. A car that burned oil. What happens if I can't pay it? Valor exercises their option and purchases the property at assessed value, which given the state of the building would be modest. Arthur removed his glasses entirely and set them on the desk. I want you to understand that refusing the inheritance is also an option. No one would fault you for it under these circumstances. Dessa looked at the photograph again. The columns, the wild grass, the boarded windows. She thought about the parking lot behind the grocery store, the crackers, the coat she'd been using as a blanket. She thought about her mother's voice, which she could still hear clearly if she tried, and about the fact that Miriam Calloway had waited until Dessa turned 18 and had left specific instructions. Had known Dessa's name and birth date and the chain of connection between them, even though Dessa had never heard her name spoken aloud in the house she'd just been locked out of. Someone had kept track of her. Someone had remembered she existed. I'll take it, Dessa said. Arthur nodded slowly, like a man who had hoped she would say that. When Dessa stepped out of his office 40 minutes later, she carried a deed in a manila envelope and the approximate awareness that she had just become responsible for a building she had never seen in a county she'd never visited with $59 and no plan. The inheritance transfer had been dated from 3 weeks prior the processing time for the legal documentation Arthur had explained, which meant 67 days remained on the Valor option, not 90. Two men standing outside the pharmacy noticed the envelope and recognized the property photograph that had slipped partially visible from the top. That the Ashworth place, one of them said. Not to her, to the other man, but loud enough. Poor kid, the second one said, and shook his head the way people do when they feel sorry for someone, but are also quietly relieved the problem belongs to someone else. Dessa drove north. The county road that led to the Ashworth estate ran through bare-limbed trees and fields that had gone fallow, in stretches of fence with more gaps than posts. The landscape had the particular quality of rural Virginia in winter, beautiful in a way that required you to be looking for it, stripped down to structure and shadow, in the clean geometry of things that hadn't been softened by leaves or warmth. Dessa found herself looking. She couldn't explain why. The iron gates appeared without warning, set into stone pillars that had once been impressive and were still in their weathered state, suggesting something about permanence. The name Ashworth was cut into the right pillar in letters that had lost their sharpness to decades of rain and frost, but remained legible. One gate hung crooked on a broken hinge. She parked at the entrance and walked up the gravel drive, her boots loud on the frozen ground. The house revealed itself gradually as she came through the overgrown hedges that had once lined the approach. It was larger than the photograph suggested. Not larger in the way that surprises you pleasantly, but larger in the way that reminds you that buildings from a certain era were built to make a statement about the people who commissioned them, and that statements once made in stone and timber outlast the people who made them by a considerable margin. The front steps groaned under her weight. The porch boards were soft in two places she made note of and stepped around. The front door, massive and dark with age, opened with the key Arthur had pressed into her hand at the end of their meeting, stiffly requiring both hands and her shoulder. But it opened. Inside silence with weight to it. Dust lay on every surface in a layer thick enough to show the history of the room in negative, where furniture had stood, where feet had moved, where air currents came in around the damaged windows. Torn curtains shifted slightly in the cold draft from a cracked pane in the side room. A chandelier above the entrance hall had lost most of its glass and hung from its chain at a slight angle, still dignified in its ruination. The grand staircase curved up from the center of the hall, its banister dark mahogany carved with a running pattern of vines and small flowers that Dessa didn't recognize as intentional until she got close enough to trace one with her finger. Someone had put real attention into that carving, real hours, real care for a detail that most people climbing those stairs would never have stopped to notice. She stayed on the ground floor, uncertain about what was above her. She moved through the entrance hall into the adjoining rooms, a parlor, a sitting room, a formal dining room with a fireplace large enough to stand in a library, where the shelves were empty, but the built-in millwork was extraordinary columns and capitals, and a rolling ladder on a brass track that still moved when she touched it. Every room had the same quality structural beauty underneath years of abandonment, like a face you can see clearly even when it's aged past recognition. She went back to the entrance hall and stood at the foot of the staircase. She wasn't thinking about anything particular. She was just standing the way you stand in a place when you're trying to decide how you feel about it, running her fingers along the banister carving, following the vines down toward the newel post, where the carving grew denser and more intricate, spiraling into a cluster of small roses at the base. Then her fingernail caught on something that wasn't a rose. She leaned in. Beneath a smear of old paint at the very base of the newel post, almost on the floor, was a shape she recognized without quite identifying it for a moment until her brain caught up with her eyes. A musical note, carved into the wood with the same care and precision as the vines and flowers, but smaller, different in character, like a signature in a corner of a painting that you only find when you know to look. Dessa crouched down. She wiped away a layer of grime with the side of her thumb. Another note, just above the first. She moved her flashlight along the base of the staircase and followed them note by note, each one slightly larger than the last, each one cut with a tool finer than whatever had made the vines and flowers. They formed a line, not decorative, directional, leading somewhere specific. She followed the line of carved notes along the base of the banister to the section of wall beneath the staircase where the structure closed in and the shadows deepened. Here the wood paneling changed character, the same mahogany, the same general finish, but the grain ran differently. She pressed against it with her palm. The sound it made when she knocked was wrong. Not hollow exactly, but not solid either. A sound that suggested depth where depth shouldn't be. She searched every inch of the panel with her flashlight. No hinges she could see, no handle, no seams she could feel with her fingers. Just the faint brass gleam of something set flush into the wood, barely visible beneath decades of varnish at a height she'd have missed standing up. She had to kneel to see it clearly. A keyhole. Smaller than any keyhole she'd ever seen, but unmistakably a keyhole. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. That night she slept in the front sitting room where the ceiling appeared solid and the fireplace still had its flue intact, though she didn't trust herself to light it on her first night in a house she didn't yet know. She unrolled her sleeping bag on a rug that had faded from whatever rich color it had been originally to something close to gray, and she lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe. Old houses breathe. She hadn't known that before. The wind outside found every gap and imperfection and moved through the building in ways she couldn't predict. A creak from the staircase, a distant murmur from a shutter. She couldn't locate the slow settling of timber that has been settling for over a century and will continue to settle long after everyone currently worrying about it is gone. The sounds were not frightening. They were the sounds of something that had been alone a long time and had learned to exist within its own particular silence. She slept better than she had in 4 days. The sound that woke her the next morning was not the house. It was a truck pulling up the gravel drive, slow and unhurried. Dessa got up and looked through the window, pulling her coat around her shoulders. A woman in her early 70s climbed out of the driver's side, carrying 2 covered dishes, moving with the particular efficiency of someone who has brought food to people in difficult circumstances, enough times that it no longer feels like an imposition. It feels like logistics. Dessa opened the front door. "You must be Miriam's girl," the woman said. "Not a question, an identification." "Great niece," Dessa said. "I think." The woman smiled. It was the kind of smile that rearranges the whole face. "Ruth Dempsey, my farm runs along the eastern field. Nobody should spend their first morning in a new house without a proper breakfast." She lifted one of the dishes. "Biscuits and vegetable soup. I made extra." They sat together on the porch in the winter light. Ruth in the one chair that hadn't rotted through, and Dessa on the steps, and Dessa ate 2 bowls of soup that tasted like something she hadn't known she was hungry for until it was in front of her. "Did you know Miriam well?" Dessa asked. 40-odd years, Ruth said, looking out across the overgrown lawn. "She was a private woman, never talked much about the family history, but she cared about this place the way some people care about a person, like it needed looking after whether or not it gave anything back." Dessa thought about that. She ever say why? Ruth considered the question longer than a simple no would have required. She used to say the house was keeping something, not hiding it, keeping it, like there's a difference. She paused. "I thought it was just the way she talked. Now I'm less sure." The second vehicle arrived mid-morning, a pickup with woodworking tools visible through the cab window. The man who climbed out was around 30, lean and deliberate, in the way that people who work with their hands develop an economy of motion that comes from knowing exactly what effort each task requires. He had a measuring tape clipped to his belt in a toolbox that looked like it had been through serious use. "Tate Ferris," he said, extending his hand to Dessa. "Ruth mentioned someone finally inherited the Ashworth place. Thought I'd come by before you accidentally stepped through a rotten floor." "Is that likely?" He looked at the porch boards beneath their feet. "Somewhat." He spent the next 2 hours inspecting the building with a systematic thoroughness that Dessa found herself following just to watch. He moved room to room, tapping walls, testing beams, running his hand along joists where the ceiling had cracked enough to reveal them. He spoke about the building the way a doctor speaks about a complicated patient, acknowledging problems without catastrophizing them, noting strengths with genuine appreciation. Good bones, he said in the library, looking up at the ceiling medallion. Better than what's been done to it since. In the East Wing hallway, he frowned. He measured the exterior wall, measured the interior again, measured a third time from a different reference point. What? Dessa asked. This room should be wider. He checked the tape again. By about 3 feet according to what the exterior says. He stood looking at the interior wall plaster, painted over at least 3 times by the variations in color visible through the cracks. Unless something's behind it. He knocked. Solid. Solid. And then near the center, a different sound entirely. A sound with air behind it. He looked at Dessa. Old ventilation, she offered. Maybe. He knocked again. Or the house has a room it hasn't told you about yet. After Tate left, Dessa spent the afternoon in the house alone. She moved slowly through the rooms she'd already seen, looking differently now, not inventorying damage but reading the building's language. Every room on the left side of the hall had a mirror room on the right. Fireplaces faced each other across corridors. Windows aligned on both facades. The proportions were deliberate, even precise. Whoever had designed this house had been thinking about balance, about symmetry, about the relationship between spaces. She noticed something else. The decorative woodwork throughout the building, not just the staircase, carried musical elements. A frieze in the parlor where the repeating motif was a series of abstract shapes that resolved when she looked at them carefully into simplified musical notation. A ceiling medallion in the library where the plasterwork included what appeared to be a treble clef, so stylized it read as purely ornamental until the moment it didn't. A carved panel in the dining room showing dancing figures, their postures suggesting movement, celebration, gathering. This had not been accidental. Someone had embedded music into the building itself, into the bones of it, as though music was not something the house contained but something it was made of. That evening, Ruth returned not with food this time, but with a small wooden box. I found this months ago when I was clearing out Miriam's cottage, she said, handing it across the porch railing to Dessa. She asked me to give it to whoever inherited the property. I held on to it because I didn't know if anyone would come. She paused. I'm glad someone came. Inside the box, wrapped in a square of faded blue cloth, was a key. Brass, heavier than it looked. The bow, the circular grip at the top, was engraved with a running series of tiny musical notes that spiraled around the metal in a pattern so fine it must have required a jeweler's tools. It was extraordinary work, not a functional object that happened to have decorative elements. A decorative object that happened to also be functional. Beneath it, a small card in handwriting that slanted slightly to the right, unhurried and precise. Some doors open only for those willing to listen. Dessa stood in the fading evening light, holding the key and looking at the house. She went inside. She went to the staircase. She knelt on the dusty floor where the carved notes ended, where she'd found the keyhole that afternoon, and she held the brass key up in the beam of her flashlight. The size looked right. She'd held enough wrong keys in her life to know when something was made for something specific. She pressed the key into the keyhole. It went in smoothly, without resistance, the way a key goes into a lock it was cut for. She turned it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just the sound of her own breathing and the house's usual settling vocabulary, and the distant sound of Ruth's truck pulling back down the drive. Then something moved inside the wall. Not dramatically, not with the sound of grinding gears or cinematic mechanism, but a definite, unmistakable shift, metal releasing from metal, the quiet conversation between a bolt and its housing that has been having that conversation for 80 years. A soft, decisive click from somewhere inside the mahogany panel, and then the panel moved. It didn't swing outward like a door. It slid a section of the wall approximately 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall, moving smoothly inward on some hidden mechanism that had been waiting through multiple decades and still functioned as intended. Dessa stepped back involuntarily as it opened. Cool air came through the gap. Not the cold of the outside, a different temperature entirely. Stable. dry. The particular cool of underground spaces that maintain a consistent temperature regardless of what happens above them. And a smell cedar, an old stone, and something she couldn't name exactly the smell of a room that has been sealed a long time, but sealed well without dampness, without decay. She raised her flashlight and pointed it through the opening. A passage, narrow a single person wide. Brick walls with mortar that looked unreasonably intact given the state of the plaster above. The floor was laid in worn stone tiles, each one carrying a thin, even coating of dust that looked almost undisturbed, like a record of the room's stillness. The ceiling was low-arched, the arch a dark curve in the flashlight beam, but not claustrophobic. Considered. Designed. Dessa stood at the threshold for a moment. She thought about what Tate had said that morning. The house has a room it hasn't told you about yet. She stepped through the opening. The passage sloped gradually downward. Not steeply, the grade was gentle, the kind of angle that registers in the body before the mind notices it. After 20 or 30 feet, the walls changed from bare brick to decorative brick, an arch pattern with keystones, the kind of masonry work you put into a space you intend people to see and appreciate. The floor changed too. The stone tiles gave way to a polished surface that her flashlight caught in brief, scattered reflections. And then the passage opened. Dessa stopped walking. She didn't make a sound. She couldn't. The breath went out of her and didn't immediately come back. What was in front of her was not a room. It was a theater. A complete, fully realized Victorian theater built entirely underground, sealed and preserved in a darkness so total that the dust on every surface was the only evidence time had passed at all. The ceiling vaulted above her at a height she estimated at 20 feet or more, a full barrel vault in carved plaster, its decorative ribs intact, meeting at a central spine that ran the length of the space. From that spine hung 3 chandeliers, each one 3 or 4 feet in diameter, their crystal prisms coated in the finest possible layer of dust, but otherwise intact, each one containing the structural memory of light. The seating occupied the first 2/3 of the room, rows of chairs upholstered in deep red fabric, not rotted, not collapsed, just faded and still arranged with the precision of a space that expected an audience. Dessa counted the rows and estimated 200 seats, maybe more. The front third of the room was a stage, raised 18 inches from the main floor. Maple planking, she could see the grain even under the dust. A proscenium arch of carved walnut framed the performance space, its decorative molding a continuation of the musical motifs she'd seen throughout the house. Vines becoming strings, flowers becoming notes. The building's vocabulary repeating itself down here in the dark, where no one had seen it for 80 years. And behind the stage, rising from the floor to the full height of the vault, was the pipe organ. She had seen photographs of pipe organs, cathedral instruments, concert hall giants. This was in that category, not the largest she could imagine, but not far from it. The pipes ranged from the diameter of a human finger to the diameter of a human torso, arranged in a great symmetrical pattern across the back wall, brass and pewter and tin in varying states of tarnish, the whole assembly held in a carved walnut cabinet. Work that matched the proscenium arch, the 2 structures framing the performance space like a pair of hands held open. The keys were visible from where she stood, 2 manual keyboards and a pedal board built into a console at stage level. Dessa stood in the center of the main aisle and turned slowly. 200 seats, a proper stage, a pipe organ that had cost she couldn't calculate what it had cost, but it was not a small number and it was not a casual decision. This had been built with intention, with belief in something, not for a family to impress guests on special occasions. The scale was wrong for that. The orientation was wrong. The seats faced the stage the way they face a stage in a building designed for community, for public gathering, for the idea that an audience is a collective thing, not a collection of individuals who happen to be in the same room. She walked slowly down the center aisle, her hand trailing along the back of a seat, and the dust moved under her fingers like the surface of still water disturbed for the first time. At the far end beneath the stage, she found the first of the oak cabinets. Its doors were not locked. Inside rows of guest books, their leather spines intact, their pages carrying 80 years of stillness. She opened the first one to a random page. Names, dates, short handwritten messages in the margins. Thank you for having us. The children won't stop talking about the music. We didn't know this was here. We didn't know this was here. Dessa stood in the underground theater of the Ashworth Estate in Harwick County, Virginia, on the fourth day of being 18 years old and having nowhere to go. And she read that sentence twice. She thought about the key in her pocket, about the card in Miriam's handwriting, about the woman who had lived in the cottage behind the main house for 40 years and kept watch over a building that was keeping something, not hiding it, keeping it. She thought about the musical notes carved into the newel post, how deliberate they were, how patient, how long they had been waiting in the dark for someone with the right key and the willingness to follow where they led. She sat down in the front row of the theater, the seat nearest the stage, the seat where the sound of that pipe organ would land first and hardest when it finally someday played again. And she looked up at the vault above her and the dust-covered chandeliers and the silent pipes of the great organ, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 4 days. She felt like she was somewhere she was supposed to be. She didn't know yet what Eleanor Ashworth had built this theater for. She didn't know what had silenced it, or why the house above had been designed to make it invisible, or what the guest books contained beyond names and gratitude, or what the sealed spaces in the walnut cabinet on the opposite wall were holding, or what the brass lock on that cabinet was waiting for, or who had written the note in Miriam's handwriting and what they had meant by it. She knew none of that. But she held the brass key in her hand, and the key had fit the lock, and the lock had opened a passage that led to 200 seats and a pipe organ and the particular silence of a room that has not forgotten what it was built for, even when everyone above it has. She opened her sketchbook to a fresh page and began to draw. Dessa spent the first hours of the next morning in the theater alone. She hadn't planned to. She had told herself she would go back upstairs at first light, assess the main floor rooms more carefully, make a list of what needed immediate attention before the building became a liability rather than an asset. Practical things, the kind of thinking that produces action rather than feeling. Instead, she found herself back through the passage before the winter sun had cleared the tree line, sitting in the third row this time, with her sketchbook open across her knees, drawing the pipe organ in careful detail while the flashlight balanced on the armrest beside her threw its beam toward the stage. She drew the arrangement of the pipes first, then the carved walnut cabinetwork framing them, then the proscenium arch, which was more complex the longer she looked at it. Not just vines and musical notation, but figures woven into the design. Small human shapes caught mid-movement, dancing or reaching or bending toward each other, so stylized they almost disappeared into the decorative pattern, but unmistakably present once you found them. She was still drawing when she heard footsteps on the passage floor behind her. She stood up fast, her heart in her throat, the flashlight swinging around. Tate Ferris stood at the entrance to the theater with his own light raised and an expression on his face that she would remember for a long time afterward, the expression of a person whose understanding of the world has just shifted several degrees in a direction they didn't anticipate. "Ruth told me you found something," he said. His voice came out quieter than his normal register. The room did that. It pulled sound into itself and returned it softened. "She didn't tell me it was this." Dessa lowered her flashlight. Tate walked slowly down the center aisle, turning as he walked, taking in the full sweep of the vault, the chandeliers, the rows of red seats, the stage. He stopped at the foot of the stage and stood looking up at the organ for a long time without speaking. His light moved across the pipes, the carved walnut housing, the 2 manual keyboards of the console. "I've restored buildings for 10 years, he said finally. "Old theaters, churches. I worked on a concert hall in Richmond that dated to 1887. He paused. "I've never seen anything preserved like this underground. Not intact, not like this." "The ventilation," Dessa said. She had found it the night before, narrow shafts cut into the vault at regular intervals, each one covered by a decorative cast iron grille that from below looked like an architectural element, and from above she would later discover emerged in the overgrown garden beds as inconspicuous drainage fixtures. It was designed into the room. The air has been moving through here for 80 years. Tate turned and looked at her. Someone built this to last, he said. Someone built this to be found, Dessa said. They spent the rest of that day cataloging the theater together, methodically room by section by cabinet, Dessa taking written notes while Tate photographed every architectural detail before touching anything. The guest books in the first oak cabinet spanned decades. The earliest entries dated to the early 20th century, the latest to a period that corresponded roughly with the years when newspaper references to the Ashworth estate had gone silent. Between those dates, hundreds of names, thousands of visits, families from every corner of Harwick County and beyond. The program booklets were printed on paper that had grown brittle at the edges but remained largely legible. Community concerts, children's recitals, benefit performances for the county school, for the hospital fund for families who had lost crops to drought or structures to fire. Free music instruction offered on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, no cost, no prior experience required, all ages welcome. Every program ended with the same line printed at the bottom in small type. Every guest is welcome here. Dessa sat with a stack of these programs on her lap and read them one by one, while Tate moved carefully around the perimeter of the space, examining the structural elements, testing the floor with measured weight before committing to each step. Eleanor Ashworth, Dessa said. Tate looked over. That's the name that keeps appearing as organizer, as music instructor, as host. Dessa held up one of the programs. She ran this place, not as a private entertainment venue, as a community institution. And nobody in the county seems to know it existed, Tate said. Somebody knows. Dessa set the program down carefully. Somebody made sure they forgot. It was on the fourth day of their cataloging work in the late afternoon when the sound of a vehicle on the gravel drive above pulled Dessa back upstairs. Warren Slade stood on the front porch in a good coat, in the kind of calm, assembled expression that men in positions of local authority spend years cultivating, friendly, without being warm, approachable, without inviting anything he hasn't already decided to permit. Miss Calloway, he said, I hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all. Warren Slade, I chair the Harwick County Heritage Committee. He looked past her into the entrance hall with an interest he kept just below overt. I've been hearing about the restoration progress. It sounds encouraging. It's early days, Dessa said. Of course. He produced a business card from his jacket pocket and held it out. I understand you may have uncovered some historically significant materials during your initial survey. The Heritage Committee maintains climate-controlled archival storage and has access to professional conservators. If you found documents of real historical value, we'd be prepared to make a competitive offer for the collection. Ensure its preservation under proper conditions. Dessa looked at the card without taking it. I appreciate that, she said, but I'm not ready to make any decisions about the materials at this point. Warren nodded slowly. His expression didn't change. Of course. Take your time. He set the card on the porch railing when she didn't reach for it. I would mention, though, private ownership of significant historical documents creates real preservation challenges. Temperature fluctuation alone can cause irreversible damage to paper records in a matter of years. I understand the concern, Dessa said. I'll keep it in mind. A brief silence. Warren looked out across the overgrown lawn and then back at her with a smile that had something measured behind it. There's also the matter of the Valor option, he said. I'm aware that represents a significant financial obligation for someone in your situation. The Heritage Committee has relationships that might facilitate a resolution if you were open to exploring that. Dessa looked at him directly. What kind of relationships? The kind that help good projects find appropriate outcomes. He paused, the key word being appropriate. Harwick has a way of taking care of things that belong here if the people involved are willing to work with the community rather than against it. She still didn't touch the card on the railing. Thank you for stopping by, Mr. Slade, she said. He smiled again and went back to his car. Dessa watched him drive away before going back down to the theater. Tate listened to the account of the conversation without interrupting. "What do you think he wants?" he asked when she finished. "I don't know yet." Dessa looked around the theater. "But he knew about the documents before I mentioned them, and he knew about the Valor option." She picked up the next program from the stack. "Someone is paying attention to what happens here." She went to the county archives the following morning. The archive occupied a reading room in the old courthouse building, its shelves lined with bound newspaper volumes and property records going back to the county's founding. A volunteer archivist helped her locate the relevant decades, patient and knowledgeable, and entirely without suspicion, which Dessa appreciated. She worked through the bound volumes, methodically starting earlier than she needed to in order to establish context. The Ashworth references were initially unremarkable property records, tax assessments, the ordinary administrative footprint of a substantial landholding. Then came the newspaper references, a concert organized by Eleanor Ashworth that raised money for storm damage repairs to the county school. Free music lessons offered at the Ashworth estate, no tuition instruments provided for students who needed them. A community supper hosted during a particularly hard winter open to any family in the county, regardless of circumstance. The coverage was warm, appreciative, the kind of local journalism that recognizes genuine community contribution and reports it as such. And then it stopped. Not gradually, not a slow fade as public interest moved elsewhere. It simply stopped, the references cut off inside a single year cleanly, as though someone had drawn a line. Before the line, regular mentions of concerts, educational evenings, seasonal celebrations. After the line, nothing. The Ashworth estate did not exist in the public record for the 20 years that followed. Not a mention. Dessa requested the county event records for the missing period. The archivist disappeared into the stacks for longer than the search warranted. He returned with an expression that mixed apology with genuine puzzlement. "Those volumes aren't on the shelf," he said. "We have the years before and the years after. That specific period isn't here." "Missing or removed?" "I can't say for certain. The catalog shows them as part of the permanent collection, but they're not physically present." He spread his hands. "It happens sometimes with older records. Misfiling. Loan records that never got updated. I'll check the secondary storage, but it may take some time." Dessa thanked him and gathered her notes. She was moving toward the exit when she nearly walked into Warren Slade coming through the door. He was carrying a leather briefcase and wearing an expression of genuine surprise that shifted into something more composed within the space of a breath. "Miss Calloway," he said, "doing some research." "Trying to," she said. He glanced at the notepad in her hand without being obvious about it. "Find anything useful?" "The event records for the relevant period seem to be missing," she said, watching his face. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, something more like recognition. "Old archives are unreliable," he said. "Things get misplaced. Decades of reorganization, different filing systems, staff turnover." He smiled. "I wouldn't read too much into gaps in the record." Dessa looked at him for a moment. "I'm sure you're right," she said, and walked past him into the courthouse corridor. She sat in the car for 10 minutes before starting it. The missing records. The altered portraits upstairs, she had found them the previous afternoon. A row of family photographs in the upper hallway, where every image of the interior of the estate had been painted over with dark paint. The people untouched, but the spaces behind them erased. The silence that had fallen in the newspaper coverage like a curtain dropping. The theater preserved underground while the house above it was allowed to decay. Someone had not destroyed the record. They had hidden it. There was a difference, and she was beginning to understand what it meant. She drove back to the estate and went straight down through the passage. She had not yet opened the walnut cabinet on the far side of the theater. It was the one piece of furniture in the room with a lock, an ornate brass fixture with polished lettering carved directly into the wood of the door. open when kindness matters more than pride. She had been approaching it in stages the way you approach something you know is important when you're not yet sure you're ready for what it contains. She was ready now. She found the secondary key in the way Eleanor had apparently intended on a small wooden tray, set in the shadow beneath the cabinet, so low it required kneeling to see it. A slender brass key wound round with cream-colored ribbon. A handwritten card beneath it in the same careful script as everything else Eleanor had left. If you have found this room, remember that music was never the greatest treasure kept here. Truth was, the cabinet opened without resistance. The shelves inside were organized with a precision that suggested hours of careful arrangement. Journals, each one labeled by year on the spine. Bundles of letters tied with blue ribbon arranged chronologically. Folders containing financial records. Ledgers of expenses and donations written in Eleanor's hand. Each column adding up to the same conclusion: a family that had spent its resources on programs that served others, rather than on the maintenance of its own comfort. Concert programs arranged in chronological order. Invitation cards, hundreds of them, each one ending with the same printed line. Dessa lifted the first journal and carried it to the front row of seats. Eleanor Ashworth had not been a theatrical writer. She wrote plainly with precision in sentences that moved forward without ornamentation. The early journals described the theater's beginnings, the decision to build underground, which Eleanor attributed to practicality as much as aesthetics, wanting a controlled acoustic environment, wanting something that would endure regardless of what happened to the house above. The building process. The installation of the organ, which had taken 14 months and involved craftsmen brought in from Philadelphia. The opening night, which Eleanor described in 2 sentences: "We opened the doors at 7. Everyone came." What followed was a decade of community. Eleanor wrote about the children who came for music lessons and stayed for the reading circles, about the families who arrived for harvest suppers and left with winter provisions quietly arranged without their having to ask, about the traveling performers who came through Harwick on their way to larger venues and were offered the stage, in the pipe organ, and 2 nights accommodation, and left having played for an audience that wouldn't have been able to afford their usual ticket prices. About the evenings when the theater held 200 people who had come from every part of the county and every background the county contained. And the room held them all equally because a seat in a theater is a democratic thing. It faces the stage, it doesn't face the person beside it. And in the dark, in the music, everyone is the same distance from something beautiful. Then the tone of the journals changed. Dessa felt it before she consciously identified it, a shift in the quality of Eleanor's attention, a new cautiousness that entered her prose the way weather enters a room before anyone has opened a window. She began writing about meetings, not in the theater, elsewhere in the town, among families she referred to by initial rather than name. A concern had been raised. She wrote about the nature of the gatherings, about who was attending, about the indiscriminate welcome that some considered generous and others considered a disruption to the natural order of things. Eleanor did not quote these people directly, but her response to them was clear in the journal's subtext. She continued. The theater continued, the programs continued. For 2 more years, the programs continued, and then they didn't. The final journal entry was short. Eleanor's handwriting was the same, steady, unhurried, but the sentences were more compressed than usual. The theater would be sealed, she wrote. Not destroyed, not abandoned. Sealed and preserved and left for the future because she believed the future would eventually be ready for what the present was not. She had preserved it because she believed someone would come back. Dessa set the journal down. She sat in the red seat in the underground theater and looked at the dust-covered chandeliers and the silent pipes of the organ and the 200 empty seats arranged in their patient rows, and she felt the weight of what had happened here settle around her like something physical. The theater had not been closed because Eleanor failed. It had been closed because the community around it was not yet ready to be what Eleanor believed it could become. And Eleanor, rather than surrender to that, had sealed it all. The guest books, the music, the programs, the evidence of what had been possible, and left it intact for someone who would arrive when the time was different. She heard Tate's boots on the passage floor behind her. He stopped at the entrance, reading her face. "What did you find?" She handed him the final journal. He read the last entry standing at the end of the aisle. When he finished, he folded it closed carefully and looked at the stage. "Someone forced them out," he said. "Not forced," Dessa said. "Isolated. There's a difference. They just stopped coming, stopped supporting, let the money dry up and the attendance fall and the programs become unsustainable, and then they let the house fall apart. And eventually the theater became something that had never existed because there was no one left to say it had." Tate was quiet for a moment. "Except the records," he said. "Except the records," Dessa said. She was back at the walnut cabinet the following afternoon when she found the piano bench sitting unevenly on the stage. It caught her eye the way misaligned things catch the eye of a person who has been looking closely at everything for days, a small wrongness in a space where everything else had been placed with care. She crossed to the stage and crouched beside the bench, turned it over. The underside showed a panel fitted with 4 small screws. Not the original joinery added later, carefully done, but distinguishable from the surrounding wood if you were looking. She found a screwdriver among Tate's tools and removed the screws. The false bottom lifted free. Inside the hidden compartment lay a single sheet of paper wrapped in yellowed cloth. She unfolded it slowly at the table she had set up near the front of the stage under the best light her flashlight provided. The handwriting was not Eleanor's. She knew Eleanor's handwriting. Now she had spent days with it in journals and letters and the inscription on the walnut cabinet door. This was different. Older, shakier. The pen pressure uneven as though the hand holding it was working through something that required physical effort beyond the act of writing. There was no signature, no date, no name of any kind. Only the confession. For too many years she read, "I allowed silence to become my greatest mistake." She called Tate over. He stood beside her at the table while she read the confession aloud, her voice steady and quiet in the acoustics of the underground theater that carried sound so well. The writer did not claim to have done anything directly. That was the first thing Dessa registered, the careful distinction the confession drew between action and inaction. He had not organized anything against the theater. He had not pressured Eleanor. He had attended meetings where others decided that the Ashworth gatherings had become inconvenient, that the indiscriminate welcome had become a problem for people who believed welcome should have conditions. And he had said nothing. He had watched the attendance dry up, watched the donations disappear, watched the programs fold one by one as the financial support that had kept them alive was quietly withdrawn by people who considered themselves good members of the community and probably were in most of the ways the community measured goodness. "We did not destroy the theater," the confession read. "We simply pretended it had never mattered." And then near the end, future generations deserve better than the pride that blinded ours. The final line, I am writing this because I could not carry it any further without setting it down somewhere. Dessa slid the pages into an archival sleeve and set it beside the journals. "It doesn't name anyone," Tate said. "No. So it doesn't prove anything by itself." "No," Dessa said again, "but it matches everything else. The journals, the guest books, the newspaper gap. It's not one piece of evidence. It's 5 pieces of evidence that all point in the same direction." Tate was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do with it?" Dessa looked at the walnut cabinet, at the shelves of carefully preserved records, at the 200 seats, and the pipe organ in the vault above them. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm not selling it." She had been avoiding thinking too directly about the money. It was a skill she had developed during the days in the parking lot, the ability to keep the most frightening facts at a slight distance, where they remained visible but not immediately crushing. 47 days remaining on the Valor option. $14,200 she did not have and had no current means of acquiring. A building that required significant investment before it could generate any income. She had avoided thinking about it too directly. But that evening, sitting on the front porch steps while the last winter light faded over the fields, she thought about it directly. Arthur Hale drove up at dusk. He didn't call ahead. He just appeared the way he had throughout this process, appearing when the situation required someone to name the difficult thing out loud. He sat beside her on the steps. "I want to talk to you about the Valor situation," he said. "All right. They've made an inquiry through my office about the status of the tax obligation." He looked out at the overgrown lawn. "They're watching the clock, Dessa. They know the timeline as well as you do, and they have a development plan that has been waiting on this parcel for 18 months. If the deadline passes without payment, they will exercise the option the same day." Dessa said nothing. "I can't tell you what to do," Arthur said, "but I want to make sure you understand the situation clearly. The sale would cover the tax obligation and leave you with approximately $19,000 after fees. That's not nothing for someone in your position." He paused. "No one would fault you. You're 18 years old. You've been responsible for this place for less than 3 weeks. No one would say you failed." The field grass moved in the cold evening wind. The house behind her made its settling sounds, the slow vocabulary of old timber doing what old timber does. Dessa thought about Eleanor Ashworth writing her final journal entry with steady handwriting and sealing the theater and leaving it intact because she believed the future would be ready when the present was not. She thought about the 200 red seats and the pipe organ and the guest books filled with names of people who had needed somewhere to go and had found it here. She thought about the unsigned confession, the pride that blinded ours. "I'm not selling," she said. Arthur nodded slowly. He didn't look surprised. "Then we need to find another way," he said. "We need to find another way," Dessa agreed. She went back inside after Arthur left. She went down through the passage and sat in the front row of the theater in the dark, without her flashlight, letting her eyes adjust to the pure lightlessness of a sealed underground space, which is a different quality of dark than any dark above ground, more total, more complete, without the ambient residue of the world's light. She sat in that dark and she thought. She was still sitting there when the idea of the Heritage Festival arrived, not as a plan, but as a memory. Ruth had mentioned it in passing during their first breakfast on the porch, the county's annual celebration held every autumn. This year's festival was in 2 weeks. Dessa sat in the dark theater under the silent chandeliers and began to understand what Eleanor Ashworth had preserved this room for. Not for her, not for Dessa Calloway specifically with her $59 and her sleeping bag on a faded rug. For the moment that was now arriving. For the community that had forgotten what had been done here and would need to be reminded in a way that was larger than one person's discovery, in a way that was public documented and impossible to quietly erase again, the Heritage Festival. She felt her way back through the passage in the dark, one hand on the brick wall, ascending through the house toward the surface. She needed to call Ruth. She needed to find Tate. She needed to spend the next 2 weeks doing what Eleanor Ashworth had spent a lifetime doing, preparing a room for the people who were about to arrive. She came up through the passage into the entrance hall and stood for a moment at the foot of the grand staircase, her hand resting on the newel post where the carved musical notes began their patient descent toward the hidden door. Then she went upstairs to make a list. It was 3 days before the Heritage Festival when Ruth Dempsey arrived at the estate carrying something that changed the weight of everything. She came in the late afternoon, her truck moving more slowly than usual up the drive, as though she was thinking carefully about each yard of progress. She was carrying a leather ledger, large, heavy, its cover bearing scratches from years of storage, but with gold lettering still legible on the front. Harwick County Community Events Ledger. She set it on the dining room table where Dessa and Tate had spread the copies of Eleanor's journals and the archived newspaper articles. "My grandfather served on the county events committee," Ruth said. Her voice was careful. "When the old courthouse moved buildings decades ago, he brought home several boxes they thought were surplus. I cleaned out his storage shed this morning." She rested one hand on the ledger's cover. "I didn't know this was in there." Dessa opened it. Official entries in the formal hand of a county clerk. Dates, attendance figures, organizing parties, financial summaries, charitable collections. Every event at the Ashworth estate recorded in the public record in official county handwriting for the full period that had gone missing from the archive shelves. Every date matched Eleanor's journals exactly. Every charitable collection corresponded with the financial records in the walnut cabinet. Every program from the theater had its corresponding official entry in the county ledger. The ledger that had been sitting in Ruth's grandfather's storage shed for decades, while the archive shelf where it should have been remained empty. Dessa looked at Tate. Tate looked at the ledger. Ruth looked at both of them with the expression of a person who has just put down something she didn't realize she'd been carrying. "The missing records," Dessa said quietly. "Were never missing," Tate said. "Just misplaced." Dessa looked down at the open page names, dates, the formal record of an institution that had served its community for decades and had been made to disappear from public memory through the simple, patient mechanism of being forgotten. Not destroyed, not suppressed by force. Forgotten. She closed the ledger gently. 2 weeks, she thought. 2 weeks in the Heritage Festival. 2 weeks to do what Eleanor Ashworth had spent a lifetime preparing for someone else to do. She was ready. The 2 weeks before the Heritage Festival were the busiest of Dessa Calloway's life. She had never organized anything larger than a school project. She had no budget, no institutional backing, no title that gave her standing in a county where she had lived for less than a month. What she had was the ledger, the journals, the guest books, the programs, the letters, the unsigned confession, and the underground theater itself, and the growing conviction that Eleanor Ashworth had not preserved all of it simply to be admired in private. She started with Ruth. Ruth knew everyone, not in the casual way of someone who has lived in a place a long time, but in the deeper way of someone who has paid attention to the same people across decades, who their grandparents were, what they valued, what they had lost, what they were proud of. Ruth made calls. She wrote notes on paper she folded and handed directly to people at the post office, in the feed store, and the Methodist church on Calder Street. She did not explain everything. She said only there is something at the Ashworth estate that belongs to this county, and the Heritage Festival is the right time to see it. Tate spent those 2 weeks doing 3 things at once. He stabilized the main floor of the house so that 200 people could walk through it without risk. He built display panels in the restored reading room, 8 feet tall, 4 feet wide, constructed from reclaimed lumber he sourced from an unused section of the barn behind the estate. And in the theater, working alone in the early mornings before Dessa came downstairs, he spent careful hours on the pipe organ. He didn't tell her what he was doing with it at first. She noticed the extra time he spent on stage. She noticed him consulting technical manuals he had ordered from a specialist supplier in Baltimore. She noticed the way he listened to the instrument pressing a single key and then standing very still with his eyes closed, hearing something she couldn't hear yet. She didn't ask. She trusted the quality of his attention. One morning she passed the stage where he had the organ console partially disassembled, the inner mechanism exposed. He looked up when she came in. "The bellows needed rebuilding," he said without being asked. "The ventilation Eleanor designed kept the wood from warping, but the leather in the bellows dried out over 80 years. I've been replacing it in sections." He touched one of the lower pipes gently. "The airflow she engineered through those shafts in the vault is the only reason any of this is recoverable." She understood preservation, even if she never used that word for it. He said it as if explaining something technical. But his voice had a quality Dessa had come to recognize, the voice he used when something had moved him and he was choosing not to announce it. Volunteers arrived without being formally recruited. A retired school teacher came by after Ruth mentioned the literacy programs Eleanor had run and spent 3 days helping Dessa organize the educational records into a coherent display. 2 carpenters from the north end of the county showed up one morning and asked Tate what needed doing and worked alongside him through the weekend without discussing payment. A woman who ran a local photography archive brought her scanner and her expertise and spent a full week creating high-resolution copies of the most fragile documents while Dessa handled the originals with cotton gloves in the careful reverence of someone who understands that some things cannot be replaced. A florist came with photographs of the original garden beds extracted from Eleanor's journals, where she had cataloged the plantings by season and began the process of clearing the beds nearest the front entrance. Dessa watched all of it from the organizing center she had established in the dining room, which was now covered in timelines and cross-reference notes and color-coded stacks of document copies. She moved between the house and the theater and the county archive, in Arthur Hale's office, pulling threads together, checking dates against dates, making sure that every claim they would display at the festival was supported by at least two independent sources. She was methodical about that. She had learned it from Eleanor, who had been methodical about everything, who had understood that a record is only as good as its ability to withstand scrutiny, and that the truth is most powerful when it requires no embellishment. It was during this preparation period on the 9th day before the festival that Valor Group made their second move. Dessa was on the estate's upper floor with Tate when she heard the vehicle on the gravel drive. Not Ruth's familiar truck, but something newer, a dark sedan with out-of-county plates. The man who stepped out wore a pressed shirt and carried a leather portfolio and had the careful, groomed presentation of someone representing institutional money rather than being it. His name was Forsyth. He introduced himself pleasantly, offered a card that she took this time, and explained that he represented Valor Group's regional development interests. "I understand you've been doing significant work here," he said, looking up at the stabilized porch roof with an expression of polite assessment. "Considerable investment of time and effort for someone in your financial position." Dessa said nothing. "Valor remains interested in this parcel," Forsyth continued. "In fact, we'd like to make the situation easier for you. We're prepared to offer the assessed value plus a 20% premium, and we'd assume all tax obligations immediately. You'd walk away with clean hands and enough to start somewhere properly." He smiled the way people smile when they've decided the conversation is already over. "Given your timeline, it seems like the sensible resolution." "The timeline," Dessa said. 38 days, he said pleasantly. "We're both aware of it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Eleanor's final journal entry. She thought about the 200 seats below her feet, the dust-covered chandeliers, the pipe organ that Tate was rebuilding section by section in the early mornings. "I appreciate you driving out," she said. "The answer is no." Something shifted in Forsyth's pleasant expression. Not anger, the more contained, more practiced quality of a person accustomed to resistance who has already prepared the next move. "Miss Calloway, you're 18 years old. You have $59 when you arrived here. You have no income, no institutional support, and a $14,000 tax obligation due in 5 weeks. I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm trying to be realistic about what you're actually facing." He knew how much money she'd had. He had done his homework on her thoroughly. "I know what I'm facing," Dessa said. The answer is still no. After he left, Dessa stood on the porch for a long time, watching the sedan disappear down the county road. Valor knew her financial situation in detail. They had been planning for her failure from the moment the transfer documents were filed. They hadn't driven out here to make an offer, they'd driven out to make sure she understood how completely surrounded she was. She went downstairs. She sat in the front row of the theater in the middle of that afternoon, alone, without a flashlight, in the particular dark that is only available underground. She sat there for nearly an hour. She did not permit herself to move until she had decided clearly and without reservation what she was going to do and why she was going to do it. When she came back up, Tate was at the dining room table with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had noticed she'd been down there a long time. "Valor sent someone," she said. "I know, I saw the car." He pushed a cup of coffee across the table toward her without being asked. "What did he say?" She told him. He listened without interrupting. "What did you say?" he asked when she'd finished. "No." He looked at her steadily. "Then what's the plan?" She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. 38 days, $14,200. One heritage festival in 2 weeks that she was going to use to show this entire county what they'd allowed to be forgotten and hope that the act of remembering produced something concrete enough to matter. "The plan," she said, "is the festival, and after the festival, we see what's left standing." He nodded once. That was all. He trusted her to know what she was doing which was more valuable in that moment than anything else anyone could have offered. Margaret Knoll arrived on the Wednesday before the festival. She was the state's senior preservation consultant, a woman in her early 60s with cropped gray hair and the efficient manner of someone who has seen enough genuinely significant historical finds to be unimpressed by things that merely claim significance. She had been contacted by one of the historians who had heard about the discoveries through the network of people Ruth had quietly alerted. She spent her first hour in the theater without speaking. Then she spent 4 hours examining the documents. The journals against the ledger, against the newspaper record, against the guest books, against the financial records in the walnut cabinet. She worked the way Dessa had worked, cross-referencing, checking dates, noting correspondences. When she was finished, she pushed her reading glasses up on her forehead and looked at Dessa across the dining room table. "Your documentation is exceptional," she said. "Every major claim is supported by at least 2 independent primary sources. Several are supported by 4 or 5. She paused. "Who organized this?" "Eleanor Ashworth organized it," Dessa said. "I just found it." Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded. "I'd like to present at the festival if you'll allow it," she said. "Formally on behalf of the State Preservation Office. What you have here deserves an authoritative voice." Dessa said yes. The morning of the Heritage Festival arrived cold and clear, the kind of October morning that Virginia produces when it wants to remind you why people stayed. The main street of Harwick filled early food vendors and craft tables in the particular festive energy of a small community that has been coming to the same annual celebration long enough that the event itself is a form of memory. But the conversations kept returning to the same subject: the Ashworth estate, the underground theater, the pipe organ. What the girl from out of county had found beneath the old plantation house that had been standing empty at the edge of the eastern fields for as long as most people could remember. Dessa stood in the restored entrance hall of the estate at 8 in the morning and watched the volunteers make their final preparations. The display panels lined the reading room and the hallway, and the parlor photographs mounted beside their corresponding document copies, guestbook pages enlarged to readable size, the timeline of the theater's history running along the full length of the main corridor from the entrance hall to the back of the house. The original documents rested in glass-top cases that Tate had built from cedar and fitted with archival quality glazing, the temperature in each case regulated by small units tucked discreetly behind the display materials. At the far end of the corridor, visible from the entrance, a single door stood open, the door that led to the passage. A small card above it read, "The Theater. Please follow the path." The first visitors arrived at 9 o'clock. They came in the quiet, exploratory way that people enter spaces they have heard about but not yet seen. Tentative, observant, speaking softly as though adjusting their register to what the building asked of them. Dessa watched from the entrance hall as they moved through the displays, stopping at the photographs, leaning in to read the enlarged guestbook entries following the timeline along the corridor. She watched an elderly man stop at a photograph of a children's recital from the early part of the last century. He stood there for a long time. Then he called his wife over and pointed at something in the image, and Dessa saw the woman put her hand over her mouth. She went over. The man's name was Harold Trent. He was 81. The child in the photograph, a small girl sitting at an upright piano with an expression of absolute concentration on her face, was his mother. He had never seen the photograph before. His mother had died when he was 40 and had mentioned once that she had learned piano as a child, somewhere she could no longer remember clearly. She had said the woman who taught her was the kindest person she had ever met. Dessa stood beside Harold Trent and looked at the photograph of his mother. Then she walked him through the passage to the theater. He stood at the entrance for a long time. He didn't speak. His wife held his arm. When he finally moved down the center aisle, he moved slowly, touching the back of each seat as he passed it. And Dessa understood that he was not simply walking through a room. He was walking through a piece of his mother's life that he had not known existed until this morning. The theater filled steadily through the late morning. People moved through in groups and in pairs and alone, their voices dropping instinctively in the underground space, the acoustics gathering everything into a quality of intimate attention. Children pressed close to the display cases containing the original sheet music. Teachers examined the records of Eleanor's literacy programs with expressions Dessa recognized as professional recognition, the look of an educator encountering the evidence of another educator's work. Dessa noticed that no one rushed. That was the thing she had not anticipated or perhaps had hoped for, but hadn't fully believed that the space itself would slow people down. That the combination of the underground theater and the preserved records and the sheer unexpected scale of what had been kept here would produce in visitors not the excitement of a discovery, but something quieter and more lasting. A kind of attention, a willingness to stay with the evidence until it had said everything it needed to say. At 11 o'clock, she found Wren. The 9-year-old daughter of one of the volunteer carpenters had been given the task of guiding younger children through the display cases in the reading room, a role she had accepted with the seriousness of a person who understands that responsibility is a form of respect. She had memorized key facts from the guest books and delivered them to small visitors with the particular authority of a child who knows more than the adults around her expected. Dessa found her on stage. Wren was standing beside the pipe organ console, not touching anything, just looking at the keyboards with an expression that mixed longing with restraint, the look of someone who very much wants to do something and is exercising considerable willpower not to. "Do you play?" Dessa asked. "Piano," Wren said. 3 years. She looked at the 2 manual keyboards and the pedalboard. "Is it very different?" "I don't know," Dessa said honestly. Wren looked at her. "Has anyone played it since it was open?" "Not yet," Dessa said. Wren considered this carefully. "Someone should," she said. Dessa looked at the organ, at the pipes rising above the stage to the full height of the vault, at the carved walnut cabinet work holding it all the same musical figures woven into the wood that appeared throughout the house, above the figures of people gathering, reaching toward each other, bent in the attitude of shared attention. "Soon," Dessa said. The afternoon ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the theater itself. By 1:30, every seat was filled, and people were standing along the side aisles and at the back of the room. The chandeliers had been carefully cleaned over the preceding weeks. Tate had done it himself, prism by prism, using methods he had researched specifically for Victorian crystalwork, and now they caught the light from the portable fixtures that had been arranged along the walls, scattering it across the vault in patterns that suggested what the room must have looked like when it was lit by gas and the music was playing and 200 people had come in from the cold. Dessa stood in the back of the room and looked at what the theater had become. She had thought in the weeks leading up to this about what Eleanor Ashworth had imagined when she sealed this place, what she had pictured when she wrote in her final journal entry that the future would eventually be ready for what the present was not. Whether she had imagined something like this, the room full again, the seats occupied, the chandeliers, lit the display cases holding her careful records open to anyone who wanted to look. She thought Eleanor probably had. Eleanor had been precise about things that mattered. Dessa walked to the front of the room and stepped onto the stage. The conversations in the audience quieted without anyone having to ask. She stood at the edge of the stage and looked out across the full theater. At the elderly couples and the young families and the children sitting cross-legged in the aisle, where no more seats remain. At the teachers and the carpenters and the farmers and the people she recognized from the festival on Main Street who had come here following the word that something significant was happening, who had walked into the underground theater for the first time and stayed because the room asked them to. "When I arrived here," she said, "I believed I had inherited an abandoned house." Her voice went into the vault and came back changed, richer, fuller, the room doing what it had been designed to do, holding sound the way good rooms hold sound, returning it to the speaker as something worth saying. What I found was a story that had been waiting for someone willing to listen to it. She gestured toward the displays along the walls, the photographs, the programs, the guest book pages. "Everything you've seen today comes from original sources. Eleanor Ashworth's journals, the county events ledger, newspaper records, guest books, letters, financial accounts. They were preserved here in this theater for 80 years, not hidden, kept. There's a difference. She paused. Eleanor Ashworth didn't build this theater for her family. She built it for this county. Every program was free or by donation. Every seat was available to anyone who came. Every music lesson, every literacy evening, every charity concert, every community supper, all of it documented in the records you've been reading today. All of it supported for years by this community. And then slowly that support was withdrawn, not by conflict, not by any single decision, just by the quiet, patient mechanism of people choosing not to come, choosing not to give, choosing not to remember. The theater was completely silent. The theater didn't close because it failed, Dessa said. It closed because the community wasn't yet ready to be what Eleanor believed it could become. She understood that. She sealed this room and preserved everything in it and left it for the future. For a moment when the community might be ready to look at its own history honestly and decide what it wanted to do with what it found. She stepped back. Margaret Noel came to the stage. The preservation consultant spoke with the measured authority of someone whose professional credibility rested on exactness. She presented the documentation methodically, the correspondences between the private records and the official county ledger, the newspaper coverage, and its abrupt cessation, the architectural evidence of the theater's deliberate preservation. She did not offer interpretation beyond what the evidence supported. She did not name villains or assign blame. She simply demonstrated point by point that what had been found here was real, was documented, and was exactly what it appeared to be. When she concluded, the applause was warm, but not exuberant. The room had the quality of an audience that is processing something rather than reacting to it. Then Warren Slade stood up. He rose from his seat in the third row, the seat Dessa had noticed him choose when he arrived near the center, where he could see everything and be seen, and he walked to the stage with the measured pace of a man who has decided something and is carrying the decision carefully. He stood at the edge of the stage without taking the microphone. "My family has lived in Harwick County for 6 generations," he said. His voice was steady. He was not performing steadiness. It was the real thing, the kind that comes from having worked something out before the moment arrives. "I've spent most of my adult life on the Heritage Committee because I believe this county's history matters and should be preserved." A pause. "3 weeks ago, I came to the Ashworth estate and offered to purchase the documents Miss Calloway had discovered. I told her that private ownership created preservation challenges." He looked at Dessa briefly. That was true. It was also not the whole truth. The room was very still. "When I saw the unsigned confession in this theater, I recognized the handwriting." He stopped. "Let that settle. My great-grandfather served on the county events committee during the period when support for the Ashworth programs was withdrawn. The confession that was found beneath the piano bench on that stage was written in his hand. I recognized it from his personal letters, which my family has kept." He did not look away from the audience. "I came here to protect those records from becoming public because I was afraid of what they would mean for my family's reputation in this county. I told myself it was about preservation. It was about pride." He paused again. "Miss Calloway did not sell the documents. She chose instead to show them to everyone, and she was right to do so." He turned to face Dessa directly. "On behalf of the Harwick County Heritage Committee, I want to formally acknowledge what happened here. Not to assign punishment that time has passed and those people are gone, but to say clearly for the public record that this theater served this community with genuine distinction. That its closure was a loss this county chose and should have chosen differently. And that the records Eleanor Ashworth preserved deserve permanent protection and public access." He unfolded a document from his jacket pocket. "The Heritage Committee voted this morning to recommend the Ashworth Estate for designation as a county heritage site. That designation would provide permanent protection for the building and the collection, and would establish a preservation endowment sufficient to resolve all outstanding tax obligations, including the valor option, which would be rendered void under the terms of the Heritage Protection Statute. He looked at Dessa. If Miss Calloway is willing to accept the designation. The last sentence reached her fully. The valor option rendered void. $14,200 resolved. Forsyth's pleasant smile and his careful accounting of her $59 neutralized by a statute that had existed before Valor Group had filed a single document. She looked at Warren Slade for a long moment. She thought about the conversation on the front porch, the business card left on the railing, the careful management of what he'd said and what he hadn't said, the recognition in his eyes at the archive when she'd mentioned the missing records. She thought about the unsigned confession. Future generations deserve better than the pride that blinded ours. She thought about Eleanor Ashworth, who had built this room without knowing who would eventually sit in it, and had preserved everything in it without knowing who would eventually read it, and had trusted in the fundamental idea that good things properly kept have a way of finding the moment that needs them. Yes, Dessa said, I accept. The applause this time was different. Not the polished response of an audience acknowledging a presentation. Something rougher and more real, the sound of a room full of people releasing something they hadn't known they were holding. It was Wren who found the final compartment. In the aftermath of the ceremony, while adults clustered in conversation and children moved freely through the theater, Wren had returned to the pipe organ. She was examining the carved walnut cabinet work on the organ's housing, running her fingers along the figures worked into the wood, the dancing shapes, the reaching figures when she stopped at a carved flower near the base of the right-hand panel. This one is different, she said. Dessa came over. The flower was the same style as the others, the same vine and bloom motif that appeared throughout the house. But its center was slightly raised, almost imperceptibly. Unless you were a 9-year-old with your face 6 inches from the wood, in the particular focused attention of someone who had been looking carefully at things all day. Dessa pressed the center of the flower gently. A small compartment released with a sound that was barely a sound, a breath of mechanism, a whisper of hidden workmanship. Inside a flat wooden box wrapped in pale blue cloth. The lid bore a single name burned into the wood in careful letters. Eleanor Ashworth. Dessa's hands were not quite steady as she lifted it down. Inside the box, a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark red wax, the seal still perfectly intact. Beneath it, a folded sheet of paper in Eleanor's handwriting. She read the note aloud, her voice carrying into the theater where conversations had gradually stopped as people noticed what was happening. If you have reached this place it began, then the theater breathes again. The sealed letter must remain unopened until the people of this town have first heard the truth together. Let no family claim victory. Let no family carry shame alone. Let kindness speak before pride, just as music once did within these walls. When the community has gathered, show them the records. Show them the programs. Show them that this house belonged not to one family, but to every heart that entered it with goodwill. Only then may the final letter be opened. The theater was completely quiet. Ruth smiled through tears. Tate stood with his arms crossed and his head slightly bowed. Wren looked from Dessa to the envelope and back to Dessa with an expression of pure, uncomplicated wonder. Dessa broke the wax seal. The paper inside had yellowed at the edges but remained fully legible. Eleanor's handwriting was the same as in every journal Dessa had read, steady, unhurried, the hand of someone who trusted that the words were right and the pen only needed to follow. She read it aloud into the theater's perfect acoustics, and the room held every word. To the person who finally brought music back to this house. If these words are being read, then you have already done what I prayed someone would accomplish. You chose understanding before judgment. You chose to open these doors again rather than close them more permanently. That courage, and it is courage because the easier choice was always available, is exactly what this room was built to reward. I want you to know why I sealed it. Sealed. Not because I was ashamed, not because the programs had failed. They had not failed. They had succeeded at exactly what I built them to do. I sealed this theater because the community around it was not yet ready to be what I believed it could become. And I understood that readiness cannot be forced. It can only be prepared for. So I prepared, I preserved everything. I left the record intact. I trusted that someone would eventually arrive who understood what an open door means to a person who has been standing outside in the cold. She paused. I believe you understand that. Do not blame the children for the fears of their grandparents. Every generation inherits two things: the mistakes of those who came before and the opportunity to choose differently. You have already chosen differently. That is enough. This room was never built for dancing alone, or for music alone, or for the kind of charity that requires the giver to feel superior to the receiver. It was built for the idea that a room full of strangers given something beautiful to pay attention to together will discover that they were never really strangers at all. Let that continue. Let every child who wants to learn music find a teacher here. Let every family that needs a place to gather find a table here. Let every person who arrives at this door feeling alone leave believing even slightly that they are not. A house is remembered by the people it welcomes. Beneath the signature, in slightly larger letters, one final sentence, and a theater is remembered by the music it refused to silence. Dessa lowered the letter. The silence that followed was the kind that follows something that has said everything it needed to say. Not empty, complete. It was Ruth who spoke first, and only two words. She knew, Ruth said softly. Dessa nodded. She had known. She had built the room and preserved the records and left the keys, literal and otherwise, for someone who would arrive without knowing they were expected and find that they were exactly what the place had been waiting for. That evening, after the last visitors had gone and the volunteers had quietly departed and the estate had returned to the particular stillness it held between its moments of activity, Dessa sat in the front row of the theater alone. The portable lights had been left running. The chandeliers scattered their recovered light across the vault in the same patterns they had thrown for audiences that had come and gone before any of the people who had sat here today were born. The pipe organ rose above the stage in its walnut housing, the pipes ranging from finger-slim to torso-wide, arranged in the same symmetrical pattern that Eleanor had designed, and craftsmen from Philadelphia had built across 14 careful months more than a century ago. Dessa sat with Eleanor's final letter in her hands and looked at the stage and thought about the woman who had written it. She thought about what it must have taken to seal this room, to pack the guest books into the oak cabinets and lock the walnut cabinet and press the flower panel closed over the box with its sealed envelope, and then to walk back up through the passage and lock the hidden door and go back to living in the cottage behind the main house, while the building decayed above the place she had built and believed in. She thought it must have been the hardest thing Eleanor Ashworth ever did. And then she thought, no, the hardest thing was believing that someone would come. Tate came down through the passage. At some point, she wasn't sure how much time had passed. He came down the center aisle and sat beside her in the second row, leaving the first row to her the way he had learned to read when she needed the front position and when she had space for company. They sat quietly for a while. The organ, Dessa said eventually. Ready, Tate said. She turned to look at him. I've been working on it for 2 weeks, he said. The bellows needed rebuilding. Several of the lower pipes were out of alignment. The manual action needed complete regulation. He looked at the instrument with the expression of someone who has spent considerable time with a thing and has developed genuine regard for it. The ventilation Eleanor designed into the vault kept the wood from warping and preserved the metal, which is why any of this was possible at all. Without those shafts, the whole mechanism would have been dead decades ago. He paused. It'll never be a concert instrument again without professional restoration. But the middle register is clear. The action is responsive. Another pause. It's ready to be played. Dessa looked at the organ. She thought about Ren, the 9-year-old who had found the final compartment, who had been looking at the keyboards all day with that careful, restrained longing. She stood up and went to the passage door. She climbed up through the house and found Ren sitting on the front porch steps with her father, while the evening settled over the estate's fields. The grass in the moonlight had the silver quality of things seen from a certain distance, not neglected anymore, just large, just waiting for the attention that would come in its own time. Dessa sat beside Wren on the steps. "The organ is ready," she said. Wren looked at her. "Tate spent 2 weeks getting it working," Dessa said. "He says it's not perfect, but it's ready to be played." She paused. "Would you like to be the first?" Wren was quiet for a moment with the seriousness of a child being asked something real. "Will it sound right?" she asked. "I don't know," Dessa said honestly. "I've never heard it. Nobody living has." Wren thought about this. Then she stood up and followed Dessa inside. Tate had stayed in the theater. He had turned on every portable light he could arrange, positioning them to approximate what the gas fixtures might once have done, filling the vault with warm directional light that caught the crystal prisms of the chandeliers and threw their scattered patterns across the plaster ribs of the ceiling. The theater looked for the first time like itself. Wren walked down the center aisle with her hands loose at her sides and her eyes moving from the organ to the seats to the vault above and back to the organ. She climbed the stage steps carefully. She stood at the console and looked at the two manual keyboards and the pedal board and the array of stops arranged to either side. "Show me which stops to pull," she said to Tate. He came up beside her and indicated 3 stops in the middle register. "Simple," he said. "A foundation sound. The way you'd start if you were learning a room for the first time." Wren nodded. She pulled the indicated stops. She settled onto the bench and placed her hands on the lower manual and her feet over the pedals, which she couldn't quite reach without pointing her toes. She played a single note. The pipe organ spoke. It was not a grand sound. It was not the full-throated cathedral roar that a completely restored instrument with a trained organist would produce. It was a single note in the middle register, clear, warm, sustained by the bellows Tate had rebuilt over 2 weeks of quiet morning work. And it went into the vault of the underground theater, and the vault returned. It changed the way the room changed everything. It received, adding to it, whatever a well-designed room adds to a sound when the room and the sound are suited to each other. Dessa stood in the center aisle and felt the note in her chest. Wren played another, then a third. She was finding the instrument the way she would find a new piano, testing the action, listening to how each key returned to her, adjusting the pressure of her touch. Her feet found the pedal notes by reach and feel, not by sight. She was concentrating completely the way children concentrate when something matters to them. Then she began to play. It was a simple melody. Something from her lessons. Dessa assumed a piece arranged for beginning students, careful and measured and not technically demanding. But in the acoustics of the underground theater, with the pipe organ giving it the texture and sustain that a piano cannot produce, and the vault returning it from every direction, simultaneously, it filled the room entirely. It went into the 200 empty seats in the space between them. It went into the carved walnut of the proscenium arch and the plaster of the ceiling ribs. It went into the guest books in their oak cabinet, and the letters tied with blue ribbon, and the programs stacked in their archival order. It went into the walls that had been holding the silence of 80 years and asked those walls gently to hold something else now. Dessa stood in the theater beneath a Virginia estate she had arrived at with $59 in a sleeping bag, in the recent memory of a door closing behind her, and she listened to the first music it had heard in 80 years, played by a 9-year-old girl who had found the final compartment by looking carefully. She understood something that she had been approaching for weeks without quite arriving at. She had come here with nothing, and she had found a room full of evidence that another woman a century before her had done something extraordinary with what she had time belief. The precise and patient love that goes into building something meant to outlast you, and had trusted the future to understand it. The inheritance was not the estate. It was not the theater or the organ or the guest books or the letters or the county ledger that had been sitting in a storage shed waiting to be found. It was not the heritage designation or the preservation endowment or the community that had filled the seats today. The inheritance was the belief itself, the specific, unreasonable, sustaining belief that a room kept with care and a door left open can change the course of a life, more than one generation, if the person holding the key is willing to use it. Eleanor Ashworth had believed that. Miriam Calloway had believed it enough to live 40 years in a cottage behind a decaying building, keeping watch over a door waiting for the right person to give the key to. Ruth Dempsey had believed it enough to bring biscuits to a stranger on a cold morning because Miriam would have expected her to. Tate Ferris had believed it enough to spend 2 weeks rebuilding a pipe organ bellows in the silence of a sealed underground theater because the organ deserved to speak again. And Wren, who was 9 years old and had pressed a flower carved in walnut and found the last thing Eleanor had hidden, played the pipe organ the way she would play any instrument on any morning, with attention, with care, with the complete unself-consciousness of someone who has not yet learned to be afraid of the size of a room. The music rose into the vault. The chandeliers scattered their light. The 200 seats held their patient, accumulated quiet. The quiet of all the people who had sat in them across the decades. All the farmers and school teachers and children and lonely neighbors and struggling families who had come here because the door was open and the music was playing, and Eleanor Ashworth had believed that everyone deserved a room like this. Dessa stood in the aisle and let it all be exactly what it was. Outside above them, the estate's fields lay in the autumn dark under a sky that had cleared to the particular density of stars, visible only far from city light. The house above its boards stabilized its windows, reglazed in the rooms that mattered most. Its staircase, solid again, under Tate's careful work, stood in the dark, the way it had stood for over a century. Large, enduring, built by people who believed in permanence. In the weeks that followed, the restoration entered its next phase. The heritage designation brought resources that had not existed before professional conservators for the most fragile documents. Structural engineers for the sections of the house that needed more than Tate's skilled hands could provide a grant from the State Preservation Office that Margaret Noel had moved quickly to secure. The Valor option was formally voided under the Heritage Protection Statute 10 days after the festival, confirmed in writing by Arthur Hale, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been hoping for exactly this outcome. The estate became what it had been designed to be. Not a museum, not a monument, a place. Music lessons started on Tuesday evenings in the restored parlor, the room with the frieze where the decorative pattern resolved if you looked carefully into musical notation. A reading group met in the library on Thursday mornings. The theater opened monthly for community concerts where the admission was whatever a family could give, which for some families was nothing, which was fine because every guest was welcome. Dessa moved into the cottage behind the main house, Miriam's cottage where Miriam had lived for 40 years keeping watch. It was small and needed work, and had a view of the back garden where the florist had begun replanting the beds from Eleanor's original catalog. She fixed it up slowly on weekends using skills she had not known she possessed until she began acquiring them. She enrolled in the County Community College in January studying architectural history. She found she was good at it, at reading buildings the way she had learned to read this one. Finding the intentions embedded in their structure, the beliefs made physical in their proportions, in their ornament. Tate accepted the position of restoration director for the estate. He continued working on other projects across the county, but spent 2 days a week at the Ashworth estate, overseeing the ongoing work and teaching 2 young apprentices the specific methods that old buildings require, the patience, the attention, the willingness to understand a thing before attempting to improve it. He had a way of explaining the work that made it clear he wasn't just restoring structures. He was restoring the thinking that had gone into them. His apprentices noticed the difference. Warren Slade sat on the newly formed estate advisory board. He attended every meeting. He brought his institutional knowledge of the county and his family's records, which contained more information about the period of the theater's closure than anyone had previously known, and he shared those records without condition. His great-grandfather's unsigned confession was mounted in the archive room beside the guest books, properly labeled and contextualized, because Eleanor had preserved it for a reason, and that reason was not shame but understanding. Warren had suggested it himself. He never asked for recognition for the suggestion. He seemed instead simply relieved to be useful in a direction that felt honest. Ruth donated her collection of family photographs, decades of images from the county, that now lined the walls of the estate's archive room faces, and occasions that could be cross-referenced with the guest book's history made visible and personal simultaneously. She continued coming by twice a week with food she said was surplus from her own kitchen, which Dessa suspected was not surplus at all. She never disputed it. Wren came every Saturday. She was working through a method book for pipe organ that Tate had sourced from the specialist supplier in Baltimore, adapting slowly to the instrument's differences from the piano she already knew. She played in the theater alone on Saturday mornings, while Dessa organized the reading room above the music, coming up through the ventilation shafts that Eleanor had designed into the vault, rising through the garden beds, and dispersing across the estate's grounds in a sound that people walking along the county road outside the iron gates sometimes stopped to listen to without knowing quite where it was coming from. The estate's neighbors had opinions about this, as neighbors do. Some came to investigate and stayed to help. Others kept their distance and then quietly admitted the garden was looking better than it had in 40 years. The florist planted more beds in spring. Children from the county school came on field trips and stood in the underground theater with their mouths open and their hands at their sides, in the instinctive stillness that certain spaces produce, the stillness of a place that asks something of you simply by existing. On the first anniversary of Dessa's arrival at the estate, the first anniversary of the day she had come up the gravel drive with her boots loud on the frozen ground and her backpack and her sketchbook and $59 and no plan, the theater hosted the first of what would become annual Heritage Festival concerts. Every seat was filled. People stood along the side aisles. The chandelier light fell across the audience in the same scattered patterns it had thrown for generations before theirs. Dessa stood on the stage before the concert began and mounted a small carved plaque above the proscenium arch where everyone entering the theater would see it. She and Tate had made it together from a piece of walnut salvaged from a section of the house that had been beyond repair, the wood itself from the building shaped by the building's own history. Carved into it, Eleanor Ashworth's words from the final letter. A theater is remembered by the music it refused to silence. Then she stepped aside and Wren walked to the organ console with the composed focus of someone who has been preparing for a specific moment and has arrived at it without surprise. Wren was 10 now. Her feet reached the pedals. She arranged her hands. She checked her stops. She took a breath. And the theater, which had been silent for 80 years and had held that silence with the patient faith of a room built to last, breathed. The first note filled the vault. The chandeliers carried it in their scattered light. The 200 seats received it from 200 directions at once. The carved figures in the proscenium arch, the reaching shapes, the bent-together postures, the forms of people oriented towards something shared held still in their walnut housing, and let the music move through the space between them. Dessa stood at the back of the full theater and listened. She had arrived here with nothing but a key and someone else's faith that the right person would use it. She understood now what that faith had asked of her. Not wealth, not power, not the particular advantages that make difficult things easier. Only the willingness to open a door when you have one, and to trust that what is kept with care through however many years of silence has been kept for a reason worth honoring. A house is remembered by the people it welcomes. She had been welcomed here by a woman she had never met who had understood something about her before she was born, that she would arrive at a door with nothing, and that the right response to a person arriving at a door with nothing is to make sure the door is not locked. She had inherited a key. She had used it. Everything else had followed from that. The music rose into the vault and the light moved across the ceiling, and the full theater held its warmth and its noise and its life. And outside the estate's long fields lay under the October stars, and the iron gates at the road end of the gravel drive stood open as they would stand from now on, so that anyone coming up the drive would not have to wonder even for a moment whether they were allowed to enter. Years passed, and people in Harwick County gradually stopped referring to it as the old Ashworth Estate or the abandoned plantation on the eastern fields. To the children who grew up in the county during those years, it was simply the Ashworth House, the place where music came up through the garden in the mornings, and where you could go on a Thursday and find someone who would read with you and where the concert in October meant the season had properly changed. Dessa had not planned to stay. She had arrived with $59 and no address, in the approximate understanding that she was responsible for a building she'd never seen. Staying had not been a decision so much as a discovery, the gradual realization over weeks, and then months, and then years, that the place had fitted itself to her in the way that places do when you give them your real attention instead of your tolerance. She finished her degree at the County Community College and went on. She studied buildings the way Eleanor had built them, with close attention to the intentions embedded in the proportions, the ways that spaces communicate what they were made for, even when no one is there to explain it. She wrote her senior thesis on the acoustic design of the Ashworth Theater and the ventilation system Eleanor had engineered to preserve it, and her faculty supervisor submitted it to a regional preservation journal where it was published the following spring. Margaret Knoll sent a card. Brief and characteristic, good work. The building earned this. Dessa kept the card on the desk in Miriam's cottage. Tate continued the work. He was meticulous and unhurried and had a way of explaining to his apprentices that restoration was not the same as reconstruction, that the goal was never to make something look new, but to return it to what it had always been underneath the damage, and that this required you to understand what it had been before you touched it. His apprentices went on to other projects and came back to show him what they'd done, the way people come back to the place where they learned something important. Ruth grew older and slower and brought food twice a week and sat on the porch of Miriam's cottage on Sunday afternoons, telling Dessa stories about the county that were not in any archive. The kind of stories that exist only in the memory of people who paid attention and are lost when those people are gone. Dessa wrote some of them down. Ruth pretended not to notice, which was her way of permitting it. Warren Slade continued on the advisory board until his health made it difficult, and then he came when he could, and when he couldn't come, he sent his son, who had grown up in Harwick and now practiced law in the county seat, and handled the estate's occasional legal matters without discussion of fees. The son's name was James. He had his father's quality of stillness and his great-great-grandfather's handwriting, which Dessa had learned to recognize across years of reading old documents, and which she found she didn't think about when she saw it anymore. It was just handwriting. The man who had written the confession was gone. The admission was on record. That was what Eleanor had wanted, not punishment, but acknowledgement, not retribution, but the simple, stubborn insistence that it had happened and mattered and would not be erased again. Wren grew up. She was not Dessa's daughter. She was not her sister. She was a 9-year-old girl who had found a hidden compartment by pressing a flower carved in walnut, and who had grown into a young woman who played the pipe organ every Saturday morning and eventually every weekday morning, who had studied music formally and then come back to Harwick because the theater was where she had learned what music was actually for. She played at the festival concerts every October. She taught the younger children on Tuesday evenings in the restored parlor, the same room, the same program, the same purpose Eleanor had written down in her journals more than a century before. She played pieces Eleanor had composed and pieces she wrote herself and pieces she arranged from whatever she had heard on the radio or in the county seat or wherever life took her. And she played them all in the same underground theater with the same carved vault in the same 3 chandeliers that had been cleaned prism by prism before the first festival and were cleaned prism by prism again before each one that followed. She played the way Eleanor had built the theater, with the understanding that music is not for the person playing it. It is for the person in the room who needed it and didn't know they were going to find it here. There was a morning in Dessa's 3rd year at the estate when she came down through the passage before Wren arrived for her Saturday session, wanting to sit in the theater alone for a little while, in the particular quiet it held before anyone else was in it. She sat in the front row, the same seat she had sat in the night she found the first guest book, the seat nearest the stage, the seat where the sound of the organ would land first and hardest. She looked up at the vault, at the chandeliers, at the pipe organ rising above the stage in its carved walnut housing, the pipes arranged in the symmetrical pattern that craftsmen from Philadelphia had assembled, across 14 months, more than 100 years before anyone currently alive had been born. She thought about Eleanor Ashworth sitting somewhere above this space in the cottage perhaps, or in one of the abandoned rooms of the main house, writing in her steady, precise hand about the decision to seal the theater. Not to destroy it, not to abandon it, to seal it and preserve it and trust that the future would know what to do with what she'd kept. She thought about the kind of faith that required, not religious faith, not the faith that depends on a deity's promise. The quieter, stranger faith that says the world is capable of becoming better than it currently is, and I will act as though this is true, and I will do what I can to make the evidence available for the moment when someone is ready to use it. Eleanor had not known who would come. She had not known when. She had known only that she believed in the possibility, and that belief was enough to make her spend the last years of her life in a cottage behind a deteriorating building, keeping watch over something no one else could see. Dessa sat in the theater and thought about $59 in a parking lot behind a grocery store, and the library where she had drawn a fire hydrant to keep her hands from shaking. She thought about the card Miriam had left in the wooden box. Some doors open only for those willing to listen. She had listened. That was all it had been in the end. She had followed the carved notes down the banister to the hidden keyhole. She had pressed the key into the lock that had been waiting for it. She had stepped through into the dark and raised her flashlight and let herself see what was there. The theater had done the rest. The records had done the rest. Eleanor's 80 years of careful preservation had done the rest. What Dessa had contributed was the willingness to be in the right place with the right key and to choose at each step where choosing was possible to stay. That was not nothing. It was she had come to understand exactly what the place had been built for. On the morning of the second Heritage Festival, before the crowds arrived, and before Wren came down the passage with her music bag, before the volunteers began arriving with their coffee and their opinions about where to hang the new display editions, Dessa stood at the newel post of the grand staircase in the entrance hall of the Ashworth estate. She crouched down the way she had crouched on the first day, her first afternoon in this house, still not knowing what she was looking at, and she pressed her fingertip to the first carved note at the base of the mahogany wood. It was exactly as she had found it, slightly worn at the surface from her own fingers, returning to it across 2 years. The same careful cut, the same small, precise shape, the same quality of directness, of intention, of a person who had decided to leave a trail and had cut each note with the understanding that the trail would only be followed by someone who deserved to find where it led. She followed them with her fingertip, one by one, down to the hidden panel. The brass key hung on a cord around her neck. She wore it the way Miriam had worn it, close and warm against her sternum, so that she could put her hand over it without reaching. She didn't use it this morning. The theater was already open, had been open since the festival renovations the previous week. There was no need to unlock anything. She simply followed the notes with her fingertip and thought about Eleanor Ashworth cutting them into the wood with a tool finer than whatever had made the vines and flowers in the dark of a house she was preparing to leave as a gift for someone she would never meet. Thought about Miriam in the cottage. Thought about the card in the wooden box. Thought about $59 and a fire hydrant and the particular quality of the library parking lot in late November. Thought about what it means to find when you have nothing left and nowhere to go. That someone who came before you thought carefully about exactly that moment and did what they could to make it survivable. The passage door was open at the end of the corridor. She could hear distantly and very faint the sound of Wren coming down through the house from the garden entrance, her footsteps on the stone floor of the passage. Then the first note from the organ console, just one finding the room. The vault taking it and returning it changed. Dessa straightened up from the newel post. She walked down the corridor toward the passage, toward the theater, toward the music rising through the ventilation shafts that Eleanor had cut into the vault for exactly this purpose, so that whatever happened down there would rise up through the house and the garden and out onto the grounds, audible to anyone within range of the estate, so that the sound would carry past the iron gates and down the county road to anyone who happened to be passing. A lit sign in the dark, Eleanor might have said. Though she wouldn't have used those words, she had used the words, "She had a house, is remembered by the people it welcomes, and a theater by the music it refused to silence." which was the same thing in the end. The same belief, the same act, the same stubborn insistence that the door should stay open and the light should stay on and the music should keep playing for whoever was still out there, driving, still looking, still willing to follow a trail of carved notes down into the dark to find out what was waiting. Dessa went down through the passage. The theater was bright with morning light through the ventilation grills caught and scattered by the chandeliers filling the vault with the particular warmth of a space that knows it is being used for what it was made for. Wren was at the console with her music open, her feet on the pedals, her hands finding the register she wanted. She looked up when Dessa came in. "Anything particular you want me to start with today?" Wren asked. Dessa looked around the theater, at the 200 seats, at the carved proscenium arch, at the pipe organ and its symmetrical arrangement of pipes from finger slim to torso wide, all of it preserved by a woman who had believed the future would be ready. "Whatever you think the room needs," Dessa said. Wren turned back to her music. And the theater, which had been silent for 80 years, and now was not, which had been sealed in darkness, and now was lit, which had been forgotten, and now was remembered, and would not be forgotten again. The theater filled with sound, the way rooms fill when they have been waiting long enough, and the right person finally arrives to give them what they were built for.